the measure that was just passed by the House in the United States Congress, the National Defense Authorization Act, that has some very interesting differences with that approach. And the ones that you outlined are actually key among them, especially when it comes to Ukraine and to Europe, because they fly directly in the face of the so-called America First idea, where you retrench away from Europe. And instead, what they're doing is they're, in essence, requiring the Department of Defense, as it's properly still called, they're preventing it from withdrawing from Europe, and they're making it basically clear that they are trying to support Ukraine in spite of what President Trump has been articulating.
But first to Washington, D.C., where the House, we're talking about Congress now, so the House has approved a defense bill that would deliver an $8 billion defense boost to Europe. In an apparent rebuke, that's what people are saying, to Donald Trump's America First strategy. The National Defense Authorization Act will include $400 million in military assistance to Ukraine and other measures to strengthen the U.S. commitment to Europe's defense. And it comes a day after Mr. Trump's administration warned of civilizational erasure in Europe, and as the US proposes Ukraine should withdraw from the eastern Donetsk region in its latest peace plan proposals. Let's discuss this with military analyst Cedric Leighton. Cedric, welcome back to the programme.
Thank you so much, Henry. It's great to be with you.
Thank you. Now, some analysts here are seeing what Congress has voted for as a boost to European defence in the teeth of opposition from the Trump White House. Is that right? And how do you see it?
Yeah, I think that's basically correct. It's very interesting because there is a wing of the Republican Party that is very much in line with what President Trump has articulated, and that is this America First strategy: withdraw from Europe, withdraw from other parts of the world, concentrate on the Western Hemisphere, in other words, North and South America. And you see that formulation in the new national security strategy. But the measure that was just passed by the House in the United States Congress, the National Defense Authorization Act, that has some very interesting differences with that approach. And the ones that you outlined are actually key among them, especially when it comes to Ukraine and to Europe, because they fly directly in the face of the so-called America First idea, where you retrench away from Europe. And instead, what they're doing is they're, in essence, requiring the Department of Defense, as it's properly still called, they're preventing it from withdrawing from Europe, and they're making it basically clear that they are trying to support Ukraine in spite of what President Trump has been articulating.
And how explicit are some of these recommendations? I was thinking about the troop levels, U.S. troop levels on the continent. I think there are around 80 or so thousand, is that right, at the moment?
Yeah, at the moment there are about 80,000 troops in Europe. If you look at the majority of them stationed in Germany and in the UK. So you have that basic contingent right there. There are a few others stationed throughout, and then of course there are the ones that are on rotation through Eastern Europe, such as in Poland and in the Baltic states. So these 80,000 troops, of course, that's way lower than what we had during the Cold War, and that is a reflection of the current environment as it exists at the moment. But the idea is that an American troop presence will be basically critical to serve as basically a tripwire in case the Russians decided that they needed to that they wanted to move into a NATO country such as the Baltic states or Poland.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the budget for the Pentagon that's been approved by the House is $900 billion, and people are saying, well, it's $8 billion more than the funding that Donald Trump requested in May, and people are assuming that $8 billion will go to European defence. But how explicitly can Congress, can the House mandate how this money is spent by the Defence Department?
So, under the law and under the Constitution, Congress actually does have that authority. Now, the question then becomes: is Trump and the Trump administration, are they going to follow the explicit direction of Congress? They have skirted some of the legal language that has been passed in other bills in the last year or so, but there is substantial support for Ukraine among the U.S. population. It's over 70%, and that includes obviously not just Democrats and independents, but also Republicans. And that's very much a rebuke of the so-called, America First withdrawal from Europe, and especially let Ukraine founder wing of the Republican Party. So that is a significant message, and it could be used potentially as leverage by President Zelensky of Ukraine against Trump. He has to be very careful doing that, of course, but that is something where there is a lot of support in many areas of the U.S. government for the Ukrainian war effort, and that, of course, also extends to Europe and the desire to maintain a strong Europe.
Yeah, and let's think about U.S. Strategy towards Europe more generally, with some of the reports we've had in recent days. Now, more than 50%, correct me if I'm wrong, Cedric, of Americans today trace their heritage to Western and indeed Eastern Europe. And when they hear the president and his colleagues attacking Europe for weak leadership, saying it's too politically correct, saying it faces civilizational erasure, and saying that we need to tempt Italy, Hungary, Austria and Poland to pull out of the EU, Brexit style, to cause a collapse of Europe as we know it today, what do they think?
Yeah, most Americans think that's patently ridiculous, and what they're looking at is, so let's take each of these pieces. The withdrawal of countries like Italy, Hungary, and the others that you mentioned. That is something that most Americans won't concern themselves with those details, but they do see the idea of a unified Europe as being actually quite important, and people who are who have the European heritage are looking at this and they're saying this could invite the wars of the past to reemerge. You're looking at everything from the Napoleonic Wars to, of course, the First World War and the Second World War, and those types of wars, except for, with the exception basically of the Napoleonic War, but the last two, those world wars, they basically made it necessary for the U.S. to get involved in one way or the other to safeguard democracy, and that was at the request of the Europeans. And so people whose ancestors came from Europe look at this and they say, we don't want a repeat of this. We don't want others to be put in a position where, like the Ukrainians of today, their relatives, even distant relatives, are once again forced to flee their homelands. And that is the kind of thought that I think some people here have, because they have that historical sense that there are these connections between the United States and Europe, and they're not going to tear those connections apart. They're going to reinforce those connections,
Right.
and in fact, that I think is going to be a critical component, of a policy going forward. And what might be said today in the administration may not actually be U.S. policy in the not too distant future.
Right, and when President Trump expresses frustration and tries to both sides this conflict, even though one was the aggressor and the other was invaded, was a victim, and says that the Ukrainians must cede the areas of the Donbass that they control, but isn't specifying whether or not that will be a demilitarized zone and who's going to stop the Russians walking into that vacuum. What's the thinking? I mean, do people feel that's just and the president wants to win so he can say whatever he likes, or do people see what we see here on this side of the Atlantic, many people do at least, a complete injustice here?
Yeah, most Americans see it as a complete injustice as well. And, just to reassure your listeners in the UK and elsewhere, there is a lot of concern by many members of Congress as well as the general public that the idea of rewarding the aggressor is not only a very dangerous thing to do, but a very unjust thing to do. And they look at this as, a lot of the analogies are, of course, back to World War War II when Hitler took over the Sudetenland, in 1938, with the acceptance of the European powers at the time, and that that reward of the aggressor, of course, didn't satisfy the aggressor. The aggressor continued to be aggressive, and they're worried that the same thing is going to happen with Putin, and that's why they behave this way and have these attitudes.
Indeed. Cedric, thank you very much for your expertise, spending time with us tonight. Cedric Leighton, military analyst. It's Henry Bonsu on Times Radio.